The highlands breathed in silence, the kind that weighed on your chest like a confession never spoken. Morning fog clung to the valley like a forgotten prayer, and in the distance, the trees shivered without wind, witnesses to something neither natural nor entirely human. In the heart of this isolated ranch, something had gone wrong. They once called him Majestic Man, a beast so prized that cattlemen would travel miles just to glimpse him through the iron gates. Black as a storm cloud and twice as unpredictable, he was the crown jewel of Mr. Dung's land, a bull bred not for slaughter, but for legacy. But that legacy had soured. Since the mysterious disappearance of his former handler, Chu Hai, 3 months ago, Man had turned into something else entirely, something wild, wounded, and terrifying. It started with the refusal to eat unless left alone. Then came the bellowing at dawn, guttural cries that seemed to rise from a place deeper than instinct. By the second week, even the ranch dogs wouldn't go near the eastern paddock. By the third, Man had gored a wooden gate clean through, splinters scattered like shrapnel, eyes glowing with an anguish no one understood. The ranch hands, strong men with sun-hardened skin and boots caked in mud, began quitting without notice. They spoke of a rage in the beast's eyes that mirrored something human. "He's not angry," one of them said before leaving. "He's grieving. And none of us can reach him." Mr. Dung watched from the veranda, hands in the pockets of a frayed coat that had belonged to a better version of himself. Once a man of great laughter and gentle command, his voice now rarely rose above a whisper. He had seen death, war, the collapse of markets and dreams. Yet nothing unsettled him quite like the unspoken question that lingered with each sunrise. What had they done to break the spirit of that animal? Even the old vet, Dr. Min, a man unshaken by broken limbs or dying herds, kept his visits brief. "His heart rate spikes when I approach," he murmured on his last visit. "He doesn't want medicine. He wants something we've lost." But what had they lost? Each morning, Man would stand at the far corner of his paddock, unmoving, staring toward the barn with a gaze that cut through wood and memory. It wasn't aggression. It was absence, a beast hollowed out by something none of them could name. One afternoon, just as dusk began spilling gold across the hills, Man broke loose. There was no thunder of hooves, no chaos, just the sound of silence cracking. He didn't charge. He didn't destroy. He simply walked, slow and deliberate, toward the southern fence, then stopped. As though he remembered something. As though waiting. It took 2 hours ropes and trembling hands to guide him back. But that night, no one slept easy. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that lived behind those dark, mournful eyes. And yet, as Mr. Dung stood alone by the kitchen window, nursing a bitter coffee and an older ache, he couldn't help but feel that the bull's madness mirrored something deeper. Something human. Something his. There was pain in that animal, ancient, unresolved, and not entirely his own. The beast was not just unruly. He was trying to say something, and they had all forgotten how to listen. The road to the ranch wound like an old scar, faded, unspoken, but always there. Dust curled beneath the wheels of a rusted blue pickup that looked more memory than machine. Inside sat a man who hadn't spoken more than 2 sentences to another soul in nearly 3 days. His name was Nam. No one had called him that with warmth in years. He wasn't young, not anymore. The sharpness in his jaw had dulled with time, and his shoulders carried the kind of weight no war medal ever acknowledged. His eyes, deep, lined, and unreadable, moved slowly over the landscape like someone reacquainting himself with a home he wasn't sure still welcomed him. The ranch emerged over the final rise, weather-beaten and tired, like the people who lived on it. The wind carried a strange tension, as if the land itself held its breath. Nam parked beside the main house and sat for a moment with the engine ticking, hands resting on the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding him in place. He hadn't planned to return. Not ever. But then the letter came, handwritten, no return address, just 3 words etched with trembling care. The beast mourns.
He knew what it meant.
He knew who it meant. The screen door creaked open before he could knock. Mr. Dung stood in the threshold like a man who had been waiting for this moment longer than he would ever admit. His face was thinner, beard touched with ash, but the old resolve was still there, buried deep behind guarded eyes. "I didn't think you'd come," Dung said. Nam looked past him toward the hills, where the faint silhouette of a bull stood motionless against the falling dusk. "I didn't think you'd ask," he replied. "No handshakes. No backslaps. Just silence, the kind only two men can share when there's too much history between them for small talk." That night, Nam didn't sleep in the guest room. He walked out to the eastern paddock, sat cross-legged in the dry grass, and waited. The moon cast a soft silver glow over the pasture, painting the scene in quiet sorrow. Man stood at the edge, unmoving, the wind ruffling his thick black coat. For a long time, neither man nor beast acknowledged the other. And then, slowly, Man turned his head. His eyes met Nam's, not in fury, not in fear, but in the heavy recognition of something broken long ago. There was pain in that look, accusation, maybe, but also something softer, something like memory. Nam didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let the silence stretch between them, wide enough to carry everything they'd both lost. The next morning, the ranch hands found him there, still sitting in the grass, boots damp with dew, eyes hollow but locked on the bull with an intensity that unsettled them. "Who is he?" one whispered. Mr. Dung stood behind them, watching with a mix of guilt and gratitude. "He's the only one the beast never tried to kill," he said. "And the only one who ever knew why." By midday, Nam had set up camp near the paddock. No tools. No whips. No cages. Just an old canvas tarp, a tin kettle, and silence. He didn't speak to the men. Didn't ask for food. Every motion he made was measured, deliberate, and deeply familiar, like someone slipping into the skin of a life he'd once shed. For days, he remained there, waiting, watching, listening, and slowly, Man began to change. He still kept his distance, but the madness in his eyes dimmed, softened by something unnamed. On the fifth night, Nam lit a fire and hummed a song only soldiers and lost children remembered. The bull edged closer, not by command, but by choice. There was no miracle, no moment of cinematic redemption. Just a quiet truth beginning to rebuild itself between two broken things that once knew each other in a different life. And in that quiet space, something sacred stirred. Not forgiveness, not peace, but the fragile beginning of both. The morning air was heavier than usual, soaked with a kind of tension that clung to the skin like the memory of a bruise. Even the wind, normally sharp and restless on the ranch, had grown still, as if holding back breath for something it could not name. Nam had risen before dawn, his eyes hollowed by time and thought, his movements quiet and exact. He knelt beside the watering trough, rinsing his face in the chilled silver of early light. Behind him, the bull man stood like a sentinel, closer now than in days past, his massive chest rising slow and even. There was something calm in the space between them now. No trust, not yet, but a truce forged from long nights and the shared ache of old wounds. Nam was drying his hands on a rag when he felt it. A shift. Not in the air, not in the wind, but something deeper, an old presence, unexpected and forgotten, rising like a half-remembered tune. He turned slowly. At the edge of the tree line, where the orchard had long since turned wild, stood a figure that did not belong. The man was tall, dressed in dark gray, coat dusted with travel and time. His face was obscured by the brim of a weathered hat, but his posture spoke of authority, the kind not taught, but born into. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there watching. Nam narrowed his eyes. Every nerve in his body stiffened. Not in fear, but in recognition. He took a step forward. The figure tilted his head, slowly, deliberately. There was something old in that gesture. Something deeply familiar. "You came back," Nam said aloud. His voice cracked like old leather. The figure didn't respond, but the trees behind him seemed to shift, as if leaning closer to listen. Nam took another step. The distance between them refused to shrink. "I buried you," Nam said, his voice lower now. On the border, near the limestone cliffs. You were gone. Still no reply. But now Nam could see his face, partially lit by the morning sun.
Pale.
Weathered. Eyes like burnt copper, steady and unreadable. The face of Hai. But Hai had died 20 years ago. Shot through the lungs on a mission they never should have taken. Nam had carried him on his back for miles, blood soaking through his uniform, until the body had gone cold and limp. He had wept for the first time in years that night, alone, angry, screaming at a sky that never answered. And yet here he was, or something that looked like him. The same scar beneath his left cheek. The same twist of the jaw when he breathed. Nam didn't ask how. He didn't trust his voice to carry that question without shattering. You left us, Nam whispered. You left me. Finally, the figure spoke, soft, raspy, like wind through bone. I never left. You just stopped looking. Nam flinched. Not from fear. From pain. Are you real? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. The man, Hai or whatever stood there, did not reply. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the bull, who had also raised his head. Man locked eyes with the apparition, and for the briefest moment, the beast trembled. You brought the ghost back with you, the man said. But you never buried yours. Nam clenched his fists. His breath caught in his chest like a hook. What do you want from me? I want you to remember, the man said. Not just what happened.
But why?
Nam opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The man, the ghost, stepped back into the treeline. No sound. No footprints. Just the sway of branches and the unbearable weight of things left unsaid. Nam stood there long after the figure vanished. He didn't move when the wind returned, didn't blink when man came to stand beside him, close enough to brush his shoulder.
The world was different now.
Or maybe he was. The past had returned, not to haunt, but to demand witness. That night, Nam lit a fire and pulled from his pack a notebook he hadn't opened in over a decade. He stared at the first blank page, fingers trembling. Outside the circle of firelight, shadows danced between the trees. One of them paused for just a second, before disappearing once more. And in the silence that followed, Nam wrote the first sentence. I was not the only one who survived. The days folded into one another like old pages in a forgotten book, creased with silence, heavy with waiting. There was no schedule, no plan. Just a quiet rhythm shaped by breath, by instinct, and by a kind of patience that only those who had lost enough could understand. Nam never tried to tame the bull. He never touched him, never forced a gesture. Instead, he simply existed near man, present, constant, and still. At dawn, he would rise and walk the fence line with the same calm precision he used to sweep for mines in a country that had never truly known peace. At noon, he would sit beneath the lone eucalyptus tree and sip bitter coffee from a tin cup, eyes always on the animal, heart beating to a language older than words. And slowly, so slowly, it began to show. At first, it was the way man stopped flinching at the sound of boots. Then the way he no longer turned away when Nam approached with his back exposed. Then, one morning, with the sun still bleeding gold over the hills, the bull walked past the fence and stood beside Nam, close enough that their shadows touched. They did not look at each other. They didn't have to. There is a kind of bond that forms not through talk, not through training, but through shared stillness. The kind forged in trenches and monsoon jungles, where the only measure of loyalty is who remains when the noise dies down. Nam knew this kind of bond. He had lived it in the eyes of men who never made it back, in the hands that had pulled him out from under gunfire, and in the soft sobs of boys who never wanted to be heroes. And now he saw it again, in the quiet proximity of a bull once driven mad by grief. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. But it was presence. And that, to Nam, meant everything. The ranch hands watched from a distance, unsure what they were witnessing. They had seen trainers, experts, even exorcists come and go, each one trying to fix the beast. But Nam didn't fix. He listened. He waited. And somehow, in that stillness, the bull had begun to breathe differently. Mr. Dung stood on the porch one afternoon, arms crossed, heart heavier than he'd admit. He watched as Man lay down in the open pasture, unchained, unprovoked, while Nam sat near, sketching something into the dirt with a stick. There was no fanfare, no sudden change, just the quiet miracle of two creatures deciding not to fear each other anymore. "He's not just calming the bull," one of the younger workers murmured, almost afraid to speak it aloud. "He's mourning with him," and perhaps that was the truth. Nam never spoke of his past, but it hung around him like a faded uniform, visible to those who looked long enough. There were nights when he sat by the fire unmoving, eyes locked on flames that flickered like the memory of gunfire. On those nights, men often stood nearby, unmoving as well, the two of them caught in parallel silences, each honoring what the other had lost. One evening, as the wind pulled clouds over the hills, Man approached Nam with a limp in his right foreleg. Nothing alarming, but enough to make Nam rise slowly, wordlessly, and sit beside him. He didn't inspect the wound. He didn't flinch when the bull exhaled sharply through his nose, almost a warning. He just whispered, "I know." It was the first time he had spoken to the bull. And Man didn't run. He stayed there, beside the man who had once fought beside ghosts and now stood guard over the broken beast. They were not friends. They were not saviors. They were witnesses, each to the other's pain, each to the slow thaw of old rage. And in that long stretch of silent days, something sacred grew. Not loud, not sudden, but deep and rooted. It was not redemption. It was recognition. And sometimes that was enough. It began with thunder, not the sudden, sky-ripping kind, but a low, distant growl that moved like something alive across the hills, crawling through the trees, whispering warnings through the rusted wind chimes hanging by the barn. The air turned thick, the way it always did before a storm that meant business. Lights flickered in the ranch house. Somewhere, a dog whined and refused to leave its post beneath the porch. Nam stood at the gate, eyes tilted upward, reading the sky like an old soldier reading terrain. He didn't flinch at the lightning. He didn't blink when the wind picked up dust and memory all at once. But something in his chest stirred, a whisper too old to ignore. Man was restless. The bull had spent the day pacing, tail low, head twitching at every noise like he was hearing ghosts again. By nightfall, the storm had wrapped around the valley like a fist, and the bull was no longer pacing. He was trembling. Na moved quickly, but quietly. No rope. No cage. He approached like one approaches a brother who's about to run into war barefoot. And when he saw the flash in Mana's eyes, wild, half lost, half awake, he knew. The past had come back. A gate had been left unlatched. And in the moment the heavens cracked open and the first fat drops of rain slammed into the tin roof of the stables, Man bolted. Not a trot. Not a lunge. He exploded. Through the open gate, through the wind and darkness, down the muddy trail that led to nowhere but trees and cliffs and everything unkind. The ranch erupted in shouts. Boots hit dirt. Lights flared. Radios screamed static and confusion. But Nam was already moving. He didn't shout for help. He didn't wait for backup. He grabbed the raincoat hanging by the door and ran. Not fast, not loud, but with the steady stride of a man who knew that sometimes the world only gives you one shot to pull something back from the edge. The rain came hard and fast, blurring sight and thought. Mud clung to every step. Branches clawed at his arms. Lightning lit the sky with such violence it seemed like the earth itself might shatter. And then, just ahead, a crash. A snort. A cry not human, not animal, something between. Nam found Man tangled in a patch of barbed wire, the metal twisted from an old, forgotten fence swallowed by the forest. The bull thrashed, breath ragged, blood mixing with rain, eyes wide with the same terror Nam had seen in the eyes of boys trying to hold their intestines in during firefights. Nam didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees beside the bull. No gloves. No tools. Just hands, scarred, steady, sacred. He spoke in a voice so low it barely cut through the storm. Not commands. Not comfort. Just presence. It's me. I'm here. Man jerked once more, then stilled. Not calm, not trusting, but recognizing. Nam reached beneath the bull's flank, found the wire, and began to work, teeth clenched, muscles burning, every pull carving pain into his palms. He didn't scream. He didn't curse the storm. He just worked because somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't just about saving an animal. This was about saving something feral in both of them. Minutes passed like hours. The wind roared louder. And then, release. Man staggered backward, bleeding but free. Nam fell to his hands, gasping, face smeared with blood and mud and old memory. He waited for the bull to flee again, to disappear into the dark like all the things he'd lost. But man didn't run. He stood there, soaked and shivering, chest heaving with storm and fear. And then, without warning, he stepped forward and pressed his massive head, gently, into Nam's shoulder. It wasn't affection. It was surrender. Trust, raw, and trembling. Nam didn't cry. Not because he didn't feel, but because some feelings go beyond tears. He simply reached up and rested a hand on the creature's blood-wet hide and whispered, "We go home." They walked together through the storm, one limping, one silent. Two broken things choosing, for once, not to run from each other. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn was staining the clouds with bruised gold. The others stood frozen by the gate, watching as Nam and the bull emerged like ghosts from the woods. No words were spoken. None were needed. They had both survived the night. And something deeper than loyalty had been forged in the rain. The days after the storm passed like a slow ache, clear skies, birdsong, and the kind of sunshine that feels like it's trying too hard to pretend nothing happened. But something had changed. Not in the sky. Not even in the earth. It was inside them, Nam, man, and those who lived on the ranch with quiet eyes and louder questions. Ever since that night, people looked at Nam differently. The kids stopped whispering. The ranch hands nodded to him with a respect too heavy to speak. Even old Jackson, who rarely trusted anything he couldn't brand or ride, started showing up near Nam's cabin around dusk, pretending he was just checking the fences. But suspicion is like rust. Even when it stops spreading, the stains remain. Nam knew it. He could feel it in the glances people thought he couldn't see, in the half-sentences they didn't finish. The boy, Ben, was healing, but the memory of that gory afternoon hadn't faded from the town's conscience. A violent bull. A silent man. An incident too wild to explain. And then the visitor came. He arrived in a black government car that kicked dust across the driveway and silence across the porch. Tall, lean, with the gait of someone who'd spent more time with files than with people. He wore a badge clipped to his belt, not flashy, just enough to say, "I can ask questions you don't want to answer." Nam was in the field with man when the man approached. He didn't flinch. He didn't pretend. He just wiped his hands, nodded, and said one word. "Agent." The man introduced himself as Samuels, Department of Defense Liaison on Behavioral Rehabilitation and Security Oversight. A title that meant nothing and everything. They spoke in the barn, away from the others. Sunlight fell through the slats like filtered memory. Samuels pulled a file from his case.
Thick. Dog-eared.
Confidential. "We didn't expect you'd come out here," he said, almost conversationally. "After what happened in Da Nang." Nam said nothing. His eyes narrowed, only slightly, like a man preparing for a punch he wouldn't duck. "We know what you did. We know about the program. About that T-Neum 739. The name hit the air like gunpowder. Nam exhaled, slow and steady. "That program doesn't exist anymore." "Maybe not. But you do." There it was. The truth, not as an accusation, but a fact, undeniable, cold and brutal. Nam had been part of a covert military behavioral trial during the war, assigned to work with genetically enhanced animals for field reconnaissance and psychological warfare. Bulls, dogs, even birds, trained to respond not to commands, but to emotions, to trauma cues, to the scent of violence. And man, he wasn't just a bull.
He was the last.
Part of a discontinued, buried experiment. A creature shaped not for farming, but for war. A living weapon left behind by the architects who wanted to forget they ever tried to teach brutality to beasts. You bonded with him during the operation, Samuels continued. We know. You were the only handler he didn't maul. You were the reason he didn't have to be put down. And then you disappeared. Nam leaned against the stall, arms crossed, the weight of memory bleeding through his silence. I didn't disappear, he said. I retired. No one just retires from a ghost project. There was a pause, heavy and long. Then Samuels sighed and lowered his voice. The agency wants him back. There's concern. Liability. Someone finds out what he is, what he was. I know what he is, Nam snapped, voice quiet but lined with steel. He's mine. Samuel stared. He's dangerous. He's wounded. A long silence settled between them like smoke. And in that pause, Samuel saw something in Nam's eyes that no file could capture. Something raw, haunted, protective. He saved that boy, Nam said, softer now. Not because I told him, because he remembered. Because somewhere in that mess of scars and nerves and memory, he chose to protect. He's not just a weapon. He's a soul. Samuels closed the file. This conversation never happened, he muttered. But if there's another incident, there won't be. And Na meant it. Not out of arrogance, but because he knew what he and man had become to each other. Not master and beast, not soldier and experiment, but survivors, bound by something deeper than programming.
By loyalty. By pain.
By silent redemption. The agent left before sunset. The dust hadn't even settled when Jackson approached the barn, rubbing his chin. What did the Fed want? Nam didn't answer directly. He looked out at the field where man stood, calmer now, breathing slow, had lowered toward the grass like it was the only thing he trusted. They wanted to know if the past still lives here, Nam said. Jackson nodded slowly, thoughtful. And does it? Nam looked toward the horizon, the sky turning orange with memory. Yeah, he whispered, but it's learning to sleep. The ranch returned to a fragile stillness in the weeks that followed, like the hush after a long fever. The days were filled with work again. Fences repaired, hay stacked, water troughs scrubbed clean. But underneath the rhythm of daily life, something old and unresolved stirred, like bones beneath soft earth. Nam had never intended to stay long. His plan was to fade into the quiet, to let time erode the sharp edges of memory until he was just another name no one remembered. But man had kept him anchored, by need, by history, by a silent trust no human could match. And now, with the agent's visit still haunting the air like gun smoke, Nam felt the thin skin of his new life wearing thin. That's when the letter came. It wasn't much, just a worn envelope tucked into the barn mailbox. No return address, no official stamp. Just a single name on the front, Trin. Nam didn't open it right away. He stared at it like a landmine, afraid of the sound it might make inside his chest. But when the moon rose that night, and the only sound was the soft, steady breath of man sleeping nearby, Nam sat on the steps of his cabin and peeled it open. The handwriting was familiar, shaky, deliberate, full of dignity and sorrow. It had been decades since he'd seen it. But the voice in the ink was unmistakable. I know you think I'm dead. Part of me is. But the part that remembers you, remembers what we did, who we were, that part is still burning. They lied to us, Nam. All of us. You, me, the team, the animals. What they made us do, what they erased after, it was never about defense. It was about control. And now, someone's digging it up again. I need to see you. Before the past catches up with us both. Meet me where the ghosts never left, Hill 47. Full moon. 1 week. It was signed with a name Nam hadn't spoken aloud in over 20 years. Colonel Latan Hui. Nam sat frozen long after the words faded. Hui had been more than a commanding officer. He had been a friend, a brother in the shadows of covert missions, the architect of the unit that trained creatures like man, not to fight, but to feel, to predict violence before it happened. They had believed it was for peace. But peace had always been someone else's illusion. Nam thought he'd buried that version of himself long ago. But the letter ripped it open like old scar tissue. He didn't sleep that night. He sat outside with Man lying close, the bull's great flank rising and falling beside him. And sometime before dawn, Nam whispered, "We're not done yet, are we?" The week passed like the breath before a fall. Nam moved like a man counting the seconds before impact. Quiet, purposeful. He checked the saddlebags on his old dirt bike, the emergency med kit, the maps, the weather reports. He didn't tell anyone. Not because he didn't trust them, but because the weight of what he carried was too old, too ugly, too sacred to explain. On the seventh night, under a sky bright with a cruel, beautiful moon, Nam left the ranch behind. The road to Hill 47 was a path memory knew better than muscle. Once a forward outpost during the war, it had long since been reclaimed by jungle and silence. But Nam remembered every turn, every crater, every echo of shrapnel in the trees. When he reached the summit, he saw him. Older, thinner, ghost-pale in the moonlight, but undeniably hooey. He stood by the rusted frame of an old comms tower, hands in his pockets, back straight as a man still on duty. They didn't speak at first. Just stood there, two shadows caught in the breath between past and present. Then Hui turned. His eyes were tired, but lit with the same fire Nam remembered from 100 lifetimes ago. "They're building it again," Hui said quietly. "A new version. Cleaner, quieter. Civilian contractors this time. They call it Project Calm." Nam's jaw tightened. "And Man?
He's the prototype now.
Proof that it worked once. They want to replicate him, without the mess." Silence fell again. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of two men standing on the edge of something they thought they'd escaped. "I stayed quiet," Hui continued, "for years. But then I saw what they did to the others. The handlers. The animals.
Erased.
Like we were never real." "You think they'll come for him?" Nam asked. Hui nodded. "They already are." A gust of wind rolled across the hill, carrying the scent of burned grass and distant thunder. "We can stop it," Hui said. "But not from here. I need you back in the world you ran from." "I need him too." Nam looked at the horizon. The ranch was out there somewhere, still asleep, still innocent. He thought of the boy Man had saved. Of the blood. Of the bond.
"I'm not who I was," Nam said.
"No," Hui replied. "You're better. You've seen what war can't teach, Mercy. That's why it has to be you." For the first time that night, Nam smiled. Not a smile of joy. A smile of purpose. "I'll come," he said. "But I'm not leaving him behind." And in the distance, under the same moon that once lit a battlefield, something began to stir again. Not vengeance, not regret, but duty, rising from the grave. The morning light broke over the ridge like a silent vow, scattering the fog that had clung to the valley like memory. Nam returned to the ranch with the silence of a man reborn, not with fanfare or speeches, but with the steady resolve of someone who had looked into the abyss and decided to keep walking. His boots were caked with the red dust of Hill 47, and in his eyes burned a clarity that hadn't been there before. Man sensed the change first. The bull trotted toward him from the pasture, that familiar guttural grunt rumbling deep in his chest, not just a greeting, but recognition. Nam rested his hand on the creature's wide forehead, fingers brushing the old scar that curved like a river between the eyes. For a long moment, man and beast stood still, as if anchoring each other to something no one else could see. "I thought I was done," Nam murmured, his voice almost a confession. "Turns out the war doesn't end. It just changes uniforms."
But something was different now.
He was no longer running. He had chosen to stay, to face what was coming, not for revenge or redemption, but because there was a boy who still laughed by the chicken coops, a woman who made coffee at sunrise without asking too many questions, a life not perfect but real. And there was Man, who had saved them all once with nothing but instinct and loyalty. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm, half peace, half preparation. Nam began reinforcing the fences, not just to keep cattle in, but to keep eyes out. He rewired the barn's power grid, installed outdated yet untraceable surveillance gear, the kind used before satellites ruled the sky. His hands moved with the calm precision of someone who had built and unbuilt safe houses in countries that didn't exist on maps. People noticed. Mr. and Mrs. Tuan, the ranch owners, watched with cautious respect. They never asked what had changed, only offered tools, warm meals, and silent approval. Dewey, the boy who once feared man, now followed him around like a shadow, learning to walk beside the bull, to understand the quiet language of trust. Nam showed him how to read the land, how to move without disturbing the birds, how to listen not just with ears but with his spine. "It's not about teaching you to fight," Nam said one afternoon, handing the boy a compass. "It's about teaching you to feel the world before it hits you." And Dewey, who once trembled at the echo of his own voice, nodded like someone awakening into his own skin. At night, Nam would sit by the fire pit with Man nearby, watching the stars. His fingers sometimes grazed the edge of Hui's letter, folded neatly in his pocket, like a relic.
There was still no plan.
Only a direction. But that, too, was new for the first time in years. Nam wasn't just reacting. He was preparing. Then came the day the package arrived. No postmark. No label. Just a weatherproof case tucked under the saddle of the ranch's backup horse, like it had been placed there by a ghost. Inside, a set of encrypted drives, a patch from the old unit, black triangle with no insignia, and a single photo. It was grainy, probably taken from a drone, but unmistakable. A concrete facility deep in a forested area, somewhere west. Caged enclosures. A group of handlers in civilian gear. And, in the far corner, an animal. Bigger than a wolf, smaller than a horse. But the eyes, those eyes were the same. Man saw the photo and let out a low, uneasy rumble. "They're already copying you," Nam whispered. That night, Nam stood by the edge of the field, wind in his hair, scent of smoke on his clothes. Behind him, the ranch pulsed with the soft heartbeat of domestic life, distant laughter, clinking dishes, a guitar being tuned without urgency. And ahead, in the distance, was a horizon dark and uncertain, yet strangely inviting. He could go. He would go. Not because he owed anyone, but because he had something most men like him never got, a second chance. Not to erase the past, but to honor it. As he turned to head back toward the barn, he paused beside Man and whispered, "When the storm comes, we ride into it.
Together."
And somewhere in that wide, quiet country between yesterday and tomorrow, a new chapter began, no longer written in blood or silence, but in choice. Not an ending, not quite a war, just a beginning.